Some movies ought to come with a trigger warning. Yeah, I wasn't ready for The Thing with Feathers. Not really, anyway. Hey, I'm Mike. I studied film, I work in TV, and if you love movies as much as I do, hit that subscribe button and get alerted when new content's posted. The Thing with Feathers stars Benedict Cumberbatch as a graphic novelist and newly widowed father of 2 young boys. The film is about grief and how people handle grief. How men in particular handle grief. And to further dive in, how British men in particular handle grief. I only make that distinction because so much of British culture is about keeping a stiff upper lip, and Cumberbatch, who's credited only as dad in the film, is doing his best to hold it together for his little boys. The film personifies his grief as a giant man-bird, part crow, part human. The crow man is lifted straight out of one of Cumberbatch's illustrations and is realized for him and eventually the boys to interact with. At first they're afraid of the crow man, but much like grief, he just lingers there. Sometimes taunting them, sometimes commiserating, always a reminder of the loss that has occurred. If you've watched any of my other videos, I've talked about my almost psychology minor. In my senior year of college, my advisor told me that I had so many psych courses that if I stayed in school for a 5th year, I can complete a psychology minor. I'm happy to say that I graduated on time with an almost psychology minor. But what I did learn from my almost psych minor was the stages of grief. The Thing with Feathers is a perfect illustration of the 5 stages of grief. We're going to dive into some light spoilers, but nothing that should ruin the film for you guys. First is denial. We see Cumberbatch trying and failing to maintain a routine for his boys. In the immediate aftermath of his wife's death, Cumberbatch and his boys are trying their best to act like nothing has happened. But we all know how that goes. The next stage is anger. There's a scene where the crow man is teasing Cumberbatch for being a cliché widow, and they have it out in the living room. Cumberbatch is yelling and screaming at no one and everyone at the same time. He's clearly angry at the loss of his wife. As Cumberbatch descends deeper into his grief, he can't get out of bed, and the crow man offers to help with the boys. And Cumberbatch says to him, "Be kind to them." I took this for the bargaining stage of grief. Bargaining is a way to make a deal with the universe and a way to reverse what has happened. It's a way of seeking to gain control of a situation that is wildly out of one's control. The next phase is depression, and the family therapist is the one who tells us point blank that they're in that stage. He says outright, "I think we should talk about the difference between grief and despair." I don't want to give too much away, but that eventually leads to acceptance. And when you watch the film, you know exactly when that moment comes, when they accept grief into their lives. What I will say is, the film portrays grief not as something you have to battle and defeat, but something you have to come to live with, because it's always going to be there. Something that the family eventually seeks solace in, comes to need just as much as the boys needed a mother, and Cumberbatch needed a wife. The Thing with Feathers is an amazing movie about dealing with grief from the perspective of a man and a father trying his best to hold it together for his kids. But there's another layer just under the surface that I want to talk about. As I mentioned, Cumberbatch plays an illustrator, an artist, and throughout the movie he's stuck, unable to work on the project he had started before his wife's death. There's an amazing thread under all the talk about grief, about using grief to fuel your art, and thereby using art to heal a wounded heart. I don't know why I'm drawn to stories about grief. If you liked Ricky Gervais's Afterlife, it dabbles in the same arena as The Thing with Feathers, but to call them similar stories would be a mistake. I also touched on this in my review of Sentimental Value, where Alexander Skarsgård's character uses his craft, his filmmaking, to repair his relationship with his daughter. Both Afterlife and Sentimental Value take place some months or even years after the trauma has occurred. The Thing with Feathers takes place much closer to the trauma and therefore cuts much deeper. The emotions are still raw and unprocessed. There's one line that absolutely killed me. Cumberbatch is talking with a friend of his wife's, and he's talking about why he doesn't want to talk about her. He says because it reminds him that she's gone. And the friend says, "But she is gone." And he says, "Yes, but if I'm lucky, once or twice a week, I'll forget and think she'll be back any minute." And that line just slayed me. Here is a guy who is so hurt by the loss of his wife, he yearns for the 1 or 2 moments a week where he's lucky enough to forget that she died. The Thing with Feathers was written and directed by Dylan Southern. Southern has done mostly concert documentaries. He directed No Distance Left to Run, starring Blur, and Shut Up and Play the Hits with LCD Sound System, both bands I love. He also directed the documentary Meet Me in the Bathroom about the golden age of New York City's indie rock scene just after 9/11. The Thing with Feathers is Southern's first narrative film, and I'm going to go on a limb and say that Southern's visual style is a little music video, which is to say, a little surreal. Scenes that are grounded in reality slip into delusion or dreamlike states without warning. I was reminded of much of Spike Jonze's work. Jones took the same trajectory from music video to feature film, and I hope to see more narrative efforts from Dylan Southern. The Thing with Feathers is exactly what I look for in independent films. Raw, honest, emotional. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Thing with Feathers. I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. As always, if you like this content, please interact with this video. I'd sure appreciate it. Film is about community. I'm Mike, and I love movies.